Today, Brian and I are down in Carlsbad, California with Toyota's all-new bZ4X. Now, before we go any further, we should talk about the name, because to me, bZ4X sounds like what happens when you play Scrabble with a 6-year-old. The kid says, no, bZ4X is totally a word, and I get the triple word score.
Yeah, it is somewhat of a tongue twister, but for Toyota, BZ means beyond zero. Basically, beyond just a zero emissions car, they want their company's holistic practices to become, zero emissions forward. They want to make it so everything they do is zero emissions focused.
And this will be a sub-brand, not a separate brand for Toyota, so it still has a Toyota logo there, but expect more BZs. Speaking of Solterra, we should talk about that next. This is the very close relative to the Subaru Solterra. They share basically 100% of the structure and 99% of pretty much everything else other than simple exterior styling components. The two vehicles were developed together, but they were developed by Toyota. So this is a different kind of partnership than we find in the 86 and BRZ, where Subaru was the primary development lead there.
For me personally, I actually kind of prefer the way the Solterra looks over this. The Solterra gets sort of an actual grille outline to it in the front, whereas this is just very flat.
This kind of reminds me a little bit of the Lexus thing here, the spindle grille shape.
They described it as a hammerhead design, and I do see that. It does kind of look like a hammerhead shark in the way the headlights are integrated with this sort of forward-facing grille. But also you mentioned the black cladding on the side, which is actually kind of like a light gray sort of look to it.
Yeah, in this one it's not black. In the Subaru it's that matte black bumpy thing that we find in all their off-road models. In this, it is still a sparkly clear coat. It's just darker than the rest of the body itself. In terms of dimensions, the bZ4X is a compact electric crossover, not too far off Toyota's own RAV4.
Yeah, at 184.6 inches long, this is 3 inches longer than the RAV4, and you wouldn't be mistaken if you see some influence in the design here from that RAV4.
There's definitely a little bit, and then we have basically the same kind of handles that we find in every other Toyota model for the door handles. So if you're worried about the pop-out electric door handles, the fold flush ones, or all those other funky ways of opening a door, don't worry, this has regular old handles that will still work in snow and ice.
Speaking of snow and ice, the ground clearance of the bZ4X is 8.1 inches. That's a little bit less than the Solterra and less than the RAV4 at 8.4.
But it is extremely good for a new EV. If you're taking a look at a Volkswagen ID4, it has just barely over 6 inches of ground clearance, so this is significantly more. And of course, a Ford Mustang Mach-E, it has relatively little ground clearance. So if you're looking for something that's more off-road capable, more snow or slick weather capable, you might want to take a look at the bZ4X. This may have a little bit less ground clearance than a RAV4, but it has pretty advantageous approach and departure angles because of the realities of the battery electric platform. The battery is entirely in the middle of the vehicle, and that really gave them a lot of room to help sweep up the rear end and the front end design to give this better approach and departure angles. Now, what do you think about the exterior design?
Well, I think it looks really good, and it's familiar if you know what a current RAV4 looks like. People I've shown this to say it looks like a squashed RAV4, and I do agree with that. Out back, though, specifically, it reminds me of the first generation Toyota Mirai fuel cell hydrogen
Only way prettier, because I was not a fan of the Mirai, but I actually like these tail lamps, I have to say.
Yeah, they're a little bit different than the Solterras, but I actually do like that they're keeping with the sort of teardrop side, mascara look. It actually looks kind of cool in this application, and it adds to the futuristic vibe.
And they're full LEDs, including the turn signals, which is something that we don't normally see from Toyota. There's a pretty clean bumper down here and well-integrated parking sensors also. One of the big differentiators between the Toyota and the Subaru version of this vehicle is that Toyota is going to be offering a less expensive front-wheel drive model. And interestingly enough, that is going to get a different battery pack. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit here. The front-wheel drive version logically gets just one motor up front. It's a 201 horsepower electric motor producing 196 pound-feet of torque. That is good for up to 252 miles of range, depending on which trim level you get. It will drop a little bit if you get the top-end trim. The battery is a 71.4 kilowatt-hour battery pack. The cells are made by Panasonic, and the battery stretches from approximately here in the vehicle to just about the end of the rear doors. If you want all-wheel drive, you get basically the same electric motors that we find in the Subaru Solterra. They're twin identical motors producing 107 horsepower each for a total of 214 horsepower and 248 pound-feet of torque. The battery pack in that model is ever so slightly larger, 72.8 kilowatt hours, and it's manufactured by CATL. That one will give you 222 to 228 miles of electric range depending on the trim level you get, which is interestingly enough identical to what we see in the Solterra. Now, the two battery packs are important to keep in mind because they're going to charge at different rates if you like to DC fast charge. The charge port is right over here on the driver's side front fender. It uses a standard J1772 connector and a CCS DC fast charge connector. Toyota would not talk about battery chemistries, but most likely the front-wheel drive version, since it uses Panasonic cells, is an NCA battery, and most likely this one is an NMC battery because it's made by CATL. The CATL battery is the one you're going to find in the Subaru Solterra. And the different batteries and different battery chemistries are the reason that the two vehicles charge faster and slower than one another. This is also the reason that there was some confusion about DC fast charge times with the Solterra and with the bZ4X, because in other world markets, they may use different battery packs and different battery chemistries. So if you're, for instance, buying the bZ4X in Japan, the all-wheel drive version may charge faster, or it may charge at the same rate depending on which battery it has in it. But in the United States, the all-wheel drive version is going to top out at 100 kW for DC fast charging, and the front-wheel drive version is going to top out at 150. So if you want longer range and faster DC charging, you're going to want the front-wheel drive model. If you're a fan of the front trunk, you might want to shop elsewhere because there isn't one in the bZ4X. The design of the front seats is pretty similar to the average Toyota crossover. How is front seat comfort over there for you, Brian?
I would say it's pretty comparable to the RAV4 of the similar leather type. The Softex is very nice and soft. The bolstering of the back seat is just enough for my frame. It's pretty comfortable.
And on the driver's side, we have a multi-way power seat in this trim. It is a manual seat in the base model. And over there, you just have a manual seat, right?
Yeah, it's 6-way manual adjustable on even the limited trim we're in right here. There's no way to get this as a power seat, which is a little bit interesting.
And one thing that I know you complained about is that the seating position is a little bit less upright than in the RAV4. So you're definitely more reclined here. Your legs are definitely further out in front of you. So you'll notice that the seat bottom cushion is a little bit closer to the ground.
Yeah, it's sort of more sports car-esque in that way. You're not sitting on the seat, you're sort of sitting in the sort of area.
Like many EVs, this sort of blurs the lines between pregnant hatchback, sedan, and crossover because of the aerodynamic realities of having a roofline that's about 2 inches lower. Hopping into the back seat, we find a little bit less combined legroom than we find in some other EVs that are currently on the market, but I still have a pretty generous amount of legroom. Now, you will still notice the very relaxed or lower to the ground seating position. There's not a lot of thigh support here because of that.
And then with this seat pushed all the way back in its tracks, I actually still have 1 or 2 inches of knee room left. Under the seat, there's not too much foot room to be had.
Yeah, the seats are pretty close to the floor there.
But luckily, we still have a pretty flat floor across the width of the back seat here.
And this model has heated rear seats and USB ports for the rear passengers. Headroom is pretty generous as well. If I put my head all the way back here to the headrest, I have about ½ inch of headroom left.
And don't forget the panoramic sunroof is standard, so this is the headroom you're going to get on any model of bZ4X.
Yep, and headroom does get reduced just a little bit by this versus some of the other EVs out there because this has a shade that closes off that sunroof. Behind the optional power hatch, we have 27.7 cubic feet of cargo space. This is about 10 cubic feet less than you'll find in a RAV4 or a RAV4 Prime, and it all has to do with the really drastic slope to the rear hatch. As we look around the interior, keep in mind this is essentially a fully loaded version. All models are going to again have that power moonroof shade, but the moonroof itself does not open. It's just a clear sheet of glass. The driver and front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests. As with other EVs, we don't find real leather. Instead, we get their imitation leather they call Softex. In this vehicle, they're perforated because the seats are both heated and ventilated. Moving over to the doors and the dashboard, the vast majority of this interior is shared with the Solterra. So we get the same sort of soft touch materials over there on the door, harder plastics down lower, and a very, very style-forward dashboard. It is nearly symmetrical with this big bump that runs right there across the dashboard. One odd thing, Toyota said they really wanted to debulk the dashboard and make this feel really slim, give that leg area there a feeling of spaciousness, but that meant they had to delete the glove compartment down there. That feels a little bit unusual because there aren't really many places to put your registration, knickknacks, things like that. Now, over here in this center console, we have an interesting button that we don't find in the Solterra. It's this little person with some little waves going down there towards their legs. That's because over here, there's a little fabric insert. If you zoom in on that, you can see this is actually a radiant heater pad. It consumes possibly a few hundred watts. They haven't been overly specific about the power draw there, but it actually radiates heat onto your legs, sort of like a patio heater, helping you feel a little bit warmer and using less energy than heating the cabin. That's a really cool touch if you frequently have a driver or a passenger with cold legs or cold feet. There's also one over here for the driver. Now here in the middle of the dashboard, the big difference between this and the Solterra is the 12.3-inch touchscreen is standard here. We don't get a smaller 8-inch screen, at least not until we see a less expensive version of the bZ4X. This supports their latest infotainment software. You can see it is a connected navigation system with Google Mapping, based software right there. This software was developed in-house by Toyota, but uses a lot of Google connected features. It has Toyota's voice command system, very similar to Android Automotive that we find in other EVs out there. There are a few physical buttons down here, volume up and down, power knob there. Then everything else here is a touch button. So seat heating and ventilation, steering wheel heating, the climate control there, toggles for the temperature and the fan. Below the climate controls, we have the power button, 2 large air vents, and then a button bank. Let's start out on the left side. We have an electric parking brake, auto brake hold. This is the almost one pedal brake feature. They call it regeneration boost. It will not take you to a complete stop, but it will get you just about there. Park is this button here. We then put our foot on the brake and rotate this knob in and push it down at the same time for drive, reverse, and then just push it down for neutral. Over here on this side, there's a button to engage the eco mode. This is the first Toyota with X mode, something that I thought actually was a Subaru brand name, but we actually see here in the Toyota line for the first time. There are 3 different modes. There's basically progress control. We can toggle that around with this little toggle button right there, and then we can switch between snow and dirt and deep snow and mud. That changes the way the stability control, traction control, and motor systems operate. There's a button to activate the 360-degree camera system and a button for that traction and stability control software. Below that, we have a Qi wireless charging mat and the USB input for the infotainment system, but you can see that this little area here is just a bit too small to store some of those larger smartphones in. This has kind of an interesting cover with like a little grid there. So if I unplug my phone, you can see that there's just barely enough room to drop it in there. You can then close the lid, and then this surface is semi-translucent there, so you can kind of tell that you've left your phone inside. Below that, we have 2 very deep cup holders there. You can see that smaller drinks will definitely get a little lost in there. Softly padded center armrest, and that opens to reveal a fairly small storage cubby on first glance, but there is a removable section to give you even more room below. The instrument cluster is a 7-inch LCD, and its position is a little interesting. It's really quite high on the dashboard, as you can see, with this large plastic sort of arm arrangement right there surrounding it and connecting it to the dashboard. It's meant to be viewed above the steering wheel. So rather than having the steering wheel in this position where you're looking at the instrument cluster sort of through here, it's meant to be down below that instrument cluster, giving you sort of something that is halfway between the average instrument cluster and a heads-up display. With exterior temperature there, trip computer readouts, power and charge gauge, battery level over there, although it will never give you a percentage, and then a few warning lights around the display. The steering wheel itself is a round design. It definitely looks very, very modern, and it's basically the same as the Solterras as well. Stalks on either side, no regen paddles or anything like that on the back. This button bank controls that multifunction LCD. These buttons over here refer to the standard adaptive cruise control system. We then find volume up down on the left and track forward backward on the right. Now let's talk about what so many of you have been asking about, how the bZ4X drives. The answer, I think, in a nutshell, is a lot better than a lot of folks had been assuming, because on paper, 201 horsepower to 214 horsepower, that doesn't sound like a great deal. But because EVs can ramp power so much more rapidly than a gasoline vehicle, this feels pretty peppy. According to Toyota, the front-wheel drive model should be about half a second slower 0 to 60, and that's probably mainly happening down there below 30 miles an hour because of traction limitations. The all-wheel drive model is 0 to 60 in about 6 seconds, which is about half a second faster than Toyota's initial claim. They are claiming 6.5 seconds. I think part of the problem was when Toyota and Subaru were rolling out their spec sheets, they initially said something like 0 to 60 in 8 seconds. And then they said, okay, well, maybe it'll be 7 seconds. And then they said it'll be 6.5 seconds. It's kind of a slow roll to what we actually get here, which is right around 6 to 6.1 seconds. For the record, that is very, very similar to a Volkswagen ID.4 with 295 horsepower under the hood.
Yeah, I would say the power delivery is very similar in the experience to an ID.4. This definitely feels about the same, and of course the ID.4's numbers are a little bit better than this on paper, but again, numbers don't always paint the full picture.
Right, because in this, the all-wheel drive version, I should say, of the bZ4X, you can get full power, so all 214 horsepower come onto the boil right around 24 miles an hour, and in an ID.4 all-wheel drive, it's up there towards 45. So yes, it may peak at 295 horsepower, but it's not as accessible as the power that we find in the BZ.
Now, comparing the performance to a RAV4 Prime, which is the fastest 4-door model Toyota makes, this is just behind it in terms of the numbers you get out of the acceleration, but it's going to be a little bit different in terms of the power delivery, obviously, because RAV4 has that engine.
Yeah, the feel's going to be more instant than in the RAV4 Prime.
Do you see my head?
Yeah, even in this front-wheel drive model, you punch it, it goes. There's no waiting for a transmission to do anything, no waiting for the engine to spin up. And of course, in EV only mode, the RAV4 Prime is fairly slow. Now we should talk about that one pedal braking mode, or the almost one pedal braking mode. It will take you to a fairly slow speed. I'm just going to let it engage. You can see how long it takes. We started there at 41 miles an hour, and now we're down here at 20, 21, 15. And it will just keep rolling along right here around 4 miles an hour. Then you have to put your foot on the brake pedal if you want to come to a complete stop. That's an interesting twist because they've obviously gotten very close to one pedal drive. I'm surprised they didn't actually take it to that extra step. Although I have to say, I'm not the biggest fan of one pedal driving.
I like one pedal driving because once you get used to it and you can understand sort of how much length you have before you need to actually come to a stop, you can actually get really good at timing it and making it sort of a fun experience when you're trying to get through traffic and stuff like that. But another interesting thing is you can't adjust the regenerative braking. It's just on or off, and there's no way to turn on or off creep mode like you can in the Tesla models or anything like that. So with this model, when you do get down to the nearly 0 miles per hour, it's going to continue to creep. There's no way to be like, I want it to stop creeping.
My big thing is that my right foot still is able to move, even at my advanced age, is still able to move from here to 2 inches over to here and press on a brake pedal. And then, and speaking of brake pedal feel, this has a full blended braking system. So it's not like Tesla where throttle lift-off regen is all the regen you get. And to be honest, that is the big reason that we find one pedal driving in a lot of EVs, is because Tesla did it. So a lot of other EV car companies said, that's cool, we need to do it, the customer expects it. But the reason behind the one pedal driving does not actually exist in this vehicle. In Teslas, when you press on the brake pedal, all you get is friction braking. You don't get any regen, additional regen into the battery. The throttle liftoff regen, that is all you get. So they needed that one pedal thing in order to make it as efficient as possible to recapture the energy in the battery. This doesn't do that. You press your foot on the brake pedal, you can see that that regen circle continues up there to maximum regen. So if you want even more regen, you need to use the brake pedal in this one. That one pedal thing is not going to max things out.
And it's funny you mentioned the passenger experience during that. It's actually kind of similar to, I drive a manual transmission, so I'm always thinking about how to make it smooth for my passengers. And you can always tell how I'm doing based on how everyone else's head bobs. And I never thought about it thinking about the regenerative braking system. So yeah, that makes sense why there's some that are hesitant to make it a full-blown, like customizable thing. They just want it to be, you want it on, you want it off, it's up to you, that's it.
I would love to see some paddles or some buttons to adjust, though. That's something that the Hyundai Group and GM has done as well with paddles on the steering wheel. I think that would be a really cool touch. When it comes to handling, I think the bZ does pretty well. The elephant in this room, I would say, outside of Tesla, has to be the Mustang Mach-E. And I've received a lot of people asking, why are you bashing on the Mach-E so much? Or why do you bring it up so much? And the answer is that, much like Tesla in an EV conversation, now we have to also talk about Tesla and Ford, because the Mach-E is selling incredibly well. And this calendar year, they're going to sell more than 10 times the number of Mach-E's versus this. But the Mach-E is pretty heavy, and it has pretty skinny tires. That's one of the way they got to that long range there. This has 235 with tire standard versus 225s, and this one is almost 800 pounds lighter than the Mach-E that we had as a long term.
And you're definitely going to notice a difference between the way the springs are sprung, if you will. There's definitely a lot more cushion, a lot more suppleness to it. This definitely leans more ID4 than Mach-E.
In terms of ride tuning, yeah. Exactly. But with extra ground clearance. And I think the ride here is a little bit better than the ID4. If you're looking for something that feels more like, honestly, kind of a Subaru Forester, I would actually say on the road. It feels a little bit less RAV4-like and more Forester-like. Then this is going to be a great option. So for those longer highway journeys, or if you just live in an area with bad pavement, etc., this is going to be an excellent choice.
And if you're used to the steering feel, or maybe the lack thereof, from a RAV4 or a similar crossover, this is going to be right at home because it's not the most connected to the road, but it's comfortable and easy enough to use for a family that's not really looking into that too much. I don't know if you agree with that, but...
Yeah, and honestly, it's not very much different from a CR-V or a Tucson or anything else. All the compact crossovers with electric power steering, they're all going to have a very similar feel out on the road. And that's probably the best thing to say about the bZ4X, is that if you're used to a RAV4 or a CR-V or a Tucson, etc., the exact customer that they're targeting with this vehicle, you're going to feel right at home. And maybe actually a little bit excited, because 0 to 60 in this front-wheel drive model under 7 seconds, that's actually better than the vast majority of even top-end trim compact crossovers. And if you get the dual motor version, then it's 6 seconds. That is significantly faster than a RAV4 hybrid or the regular RAV4 or the Tucson hybrid, etc. That's actually pretty swift.
The more we've been driving the BZ, I've sort of started to think that the front-wheel drive one is the way to go if you don't need all-wheel drive.
You'll get that longer range too.
You get the longer range, you get the 150 kilowatt charging capability, which means you can charge this one a little bit faster, and it off the line feels just as quick as the all-wheel drive. I mean, you see my head, like it's doing it.
There's probably a little bit of a difference, but the difference is so small that most folks probably won't notice the difference after you've bought the vehicle. If you're test driving them back to back, you'll probably notice a tiny bit of difference, but after that, you're probably not going to sit there at home going, gee, I wish I had the faster one. As far as cabin noise goes, I think this is quieter in here than the RAV4. Wind noise is pretty well controlled. There is a little bit of road noise coming in through the cabin, but that big battery pack being between us and the road really helps isolate things out a bit.
Yeah, I think if I remember back to driving the ID4, you can definitely see that they feel similar in the way they drive, but then when you hit bumps, the bumps make a louder noise in the ID4 than they do here. You'll hear them, but they're a little bit more muted in this car compared to that. Now, I'm sure most of y'all here have been wondering and been waiting about this, but this is my first time in either a Solterra or a bZ4X. Alex, do you feel much of a difference?
Honestly, no, and I think Toyota was actually fairly open about that. Subaru tried to not answer the question at the launch event for the Solterra. Toyota was pretty honest and said, you know what, we did the engineering for both vehicles. They're going to drive very similarly. They deferred to Subaru for the programming of the all-wheel drive software and the stability control system and the X mode system for that, but everything else in here and in the Solterra is basically 99.9% Toyota, from the buttons, the switches, the dashboard features, etc., to the electric motors, the chargers, etc. All of that is Toyota. So the feel is honestly very, very similar. And it kind of makes sense because at the beginning, at least, this is going to be a relatively low volume vehicle. So maybe in future platform variants of this, there's going to be more differentiation. I would expect the Lexus to feel different versus these two. But the Subaru and the Toyota, they're going to be priced basically the same. They're targeting very similar shoppers. So there was no reason to spend the extra money to make them feel vastly different. It's a little bit difficult to talk about range and efficiency because we haven't had this at home for complete testing, but I expect, based on my experience in this and my experience in the Solterra, that it is going to be right in line with the EPA estimates. Since this is Toyota's first full production battery electric vehicle, you should of course expect to see upgrades in the battery pack over time and expanded range figures over time. This vehicle will support a decent number of OTA updates, but they didn't say exactly what portion of the vehicle systems were OTA updatable, whether it was limited to just portions of the drivetrain, etc., or the complete drivetrain unit. It does appear that there's a little bit more room under the body than I had expected, though, when you take a look at the cutaway for extra batteries. Now let's talk about how much the bZ4X is going to set you back and what you get for that price tag. That's the important part to keep in mind here, because Toyota has been very aggressive at the base price, but also the base set of standard feature content that we find inside. And all of that happens for $42,000. That undercuts a reasonable number of the competitors out there. It is a little bit more expensive than a Volkswagen ID4. That starts at $41,230, but you don't get an LCD instrument cluster as big, you don't get an infotainment system as big, you don't get all the same kind of standard feature content, and most importantly, you don't get a heat pump at all in the ID4. So real-world winter range figures are going to likely be better in the bZ4X because of that heat pump heater system. Heat pumps are optional in some of the competition. You can get a heat pump in the Ioniq 5, you can get a heat pump in the EV6, but oddly enough, you cannot get it in the rear-wheel drive single-motor versions of those vehicles, only in the all-wheel drive models. And in the bZ4X, it's going to be standard, and you can't get a heat pump at all in the Volkswagen or in the Ford competition. Speaking of all-wheel drive, the bZ4X is going to be the least expensive EV with that feature in the US at $44,080. It ends up about $900 less expensive than the ID4 all-wheel drive. One caveat here for that least expensive quote, remember that we don't know the price tag of the Solterra just yet. The next thing to know is that Toyota is only going to be offering two trim levels of bZ4X, XLE and Limited. You can get front-wheel drive or all-wheel drive in either option. There are options available in the Limited, but it's going to start at $48,780, and the Limited is the one that I spent most of my time in. Let's briefly talk about the range and price points for key competitors in this segment. Keep in mind the bZ4X will get you 252 miles of range in the longest range version, 222 miles if you choose the limited trim and all-wheel drive. Some people are disappointed by that, but it honestly stacks up very well against the competition. The Volkswagen ID4 looks pretty good because it just got a range bump. It gets 280 miles in the base version, 251 miles for the all-wheel drive version, but you don't get a heat pump. So in real-world winter driving, you're probably going to to get lower range than those numbers would indicate. And I would not be surprised at all if on an identical trip, the ID4 and the bZ4X ended up with relatively similar range once the temperature dropped down to maybe about 40 degrees or so. Now, the Hyundai Ioniq, that's a really stiff competitor. It's really a good EV. It's $43,650 starting, so it's about $1,600 more expensive. But the all-wheel drive option, that is quite a bit more, $47,150 for that versus $44,000 for the bZ4X. Now, admittedly, the Ioniq 5 is going to charge faster and it's going to go faster 0 to 60, but you're not going to get the same kind of feature content standard on that base model of that you will find on the bZ4X. The EV6, also a very stiff competitor here. It's going to start a lot less at $40,900, but that is the absolute base model. That's going to be late availability. It's also probably going to be slower. It's only 167 horsepower, and it's only going to give you 232 miles of range. It is going to charge rapidly, but it's not going to have a heat pump. It's going to have lower range than the base version, and it's likely going to be slower, but it is going to be rear-wheel drive. Next up, we have the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Currently, you can only get the base version of the Mach-E or the Mach-E GT, and the lead time is about 28 to 30 weeks for either of those. The middle models, the core versions of the Mach-E, those have all been paused for the moment because there's just so much demand that Ford can't meet it at the moment. So, base Mach-E, $43,895, 247 miles of range, so actually less range than we find in the bZ4X. It is going to be a little bit more fun because it's rear-wheel drive. If you want all-wheel drive, that's $46,595, and the range on that model drops down to 224 miles. Suspiciously very similar to what we see in the BZ. But again, no heat pump in that base Mach-E, so real-world winter range is likely going to be lower than the bZ4X. Also, you should keep in mind the bZ4X has wider tires, and although I haven't been able to drive the two of the vehicles back to back, I would not be surprised if the handling ability of these vehicles was honestly pretty similar. 0 to 60 times, those are definitely going to be swifter in the Mach-E, but it has relatively skinny tires, so it really depends on exactly what you're looking for, and it doesn't have the ground clearance that we find in the bZ4X. That's really a big win. If you want this level of ground clearance in your next EV and you don't want the bZ4X or the closely related Subaru Solterra, you could get a Volvo XC40 that would have about the same kind of ground clearance, but it's going to be a lot more expensive. You could get a Jaguar I-Pace that's actually going to have less ground clearance and be considerably more expensive, or you could wait for a Rivian or perhaps a Cybertruck or an F-150 Lightning, etc., but they're not quite the same thing. It's also worth noting that although I am a teeny bit disappointed that Toyota chose not to push the envelope when it comes to DC fast charge speeds, let's run through a reminder of the competition's DC fast charge speeds. So, Mustang Mach-E, it tops out at 115 kW if you choose the base battery pack. If you choose the bigger battery pack, it will go a little bit faster, but it's actually not that much faster than the front-wheel drive version of the bZ4X. Remember, the front-wheel drive version actually charges a little bit faster at 150 kW. The all-wheel drive version at 100 kW, right around there with that base Mach-E. Now, the base ID4, it will charge faster, about 125 to 130 kW. That is a 25% improvement, and that really is a good deal. Also, keep in mind the ID4 has 3 years of unlimited DC fast charging at the Electrify America network, or I should say unlimited 30-minute sessions at Electrify America. Now, Toyota is including some DC fast charging for free in the bZ4X, but they're not using Electrify America, and I have to say, I think that's a bit weird. The bZ4X is the kind of EV that is definitely better in person than it may appear on paper. On paper, a lot of people were concerned that Toyota had just phoned in their new EV, and that is absolutely not the case. Toyota has definitely applied their own set of priorities and practicalities and pragmatic engineering design to the bZ4X, but I actually think that's an asset. It ends up performing better than people had expected. The range is going to be real-world acceptable and real-world comparable to the competition. The price tag is low, the reliability is likely going to be high, and of course, if you're interested in an EV with the Toyota logo, this is going to be the only one that will do that for you at the moment. If you are one of those people that says, my goodness, they should have tried harder, it should have charged faster, it should have gone further, it should have been more powerful, then the EV that you're waiting for is the upcoming Lexus EV. Because unlike the Ioniq 5 or the EV6 or the Mach-E or arguably perhaps even the ID4 in a weird sort of twist, Toyota is deliberately choosing not to have that kind of EV in their mainstream brand. Instead, the higher performance vehicle, the one with the more luxury options, etc., the longer range, that's going to be the luxury vehicle with pricing that is likely going to be similar to the top-end trims of the EV6, the Ioniq 5, and the Mustang Mach-E. It's just not going to have a Toyota logo on it, but for that, you're going to have to wait until a little bit later this year. Hopefully, I will be driving that before the end of the year. That's what the rumor mill tells me, but I will likely be seeing it over the next few months. Be sure and sound off down there in the comment section. Let me know what you think about the bZ4X, and of course, stay tuned because I will be getting my hands on one just as soon as possible, hopefully over the next month or so, and we're definitely going to be making a lot of content for that new EV from Toyota.